Okay, we are live, and Ryan, your screen is on or you're the main.
Okay, you can see my screen? Yep. Arthur, can you confirm you can see my screen?
Not right now, please screen share again. Yes, now we can see your screen.
Okay, hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining to our latest Foam community call. Today we're going to be speaking about Foam location and the recent demo that we revealed last month. The agenda for the call is an introduction to the Foam location project in case you are new to this call and what the current progress has been. This call is going to be part one of two. The second edition in the next week or so will be a live webcast of the demo we'll be speaking about and had previously published documentation and a video of. This part two will coincide with the public release of that demo so other people can interact with that as well. So after this brief presentation and update, we are very excited to be joined by our collaborator and partner, Rick Dudley, and we will be having an interview and conversation with him about Foam location. So first off, just to start of where we are basically today, we have some announcements to make in terms of team expansion. I'll probably follow up with a blog post, but we have recently been joined by an electrical engineer named Anjali, as well as a senior electrical engineer named Nishant. They're both working out of the new lab with us. And we've also been engaging with time synchronization experts as well as other radio technicians around the world, helping us get to this milestone where we are today. So in summary, for those of you who might not have been following as closely, at Foam, we're building what we call proof of location, and we're creating an architecture that can be summarized as follows. So we're working first on what we call the root chain, which can be seen as Ethereum. And this is where kind of the logic of the protocol will live. This is the blockchain that the Foam map is currently deployed to, and what we have experience deploying smart contracts on. And in some senses, this is the easiest layer to work with. The next is what is called a sidechain. So this allows you to essentially leave Ethereum, but still be part of the blockchain architecture, and essentially run a blockchain in a zone of radios. And then the third layer of the project is actually the hardware itself. So this hardware needs to be able to run that protocol over radio, but also connect back to the root chain via Plasma. So just as an overview of where we've been with this project, I'm sure people have been following closely. And as we wrapped up launching the Foam map at the quarter 3 and 4 of 2018, we were hard at work researching different time synchronization protocols and different hardware. We've made public before that we were interested in the LoRa radio as a candidate and had done some stress tests on those previously. Starting in this year, in 2019, we've actually began to code up this kind of project. So that means actually writing a time synchronization protocol as well as the blockchain software that powers it. And all of that kind of accumulated in a local testnet we set up and had a previous community call on. We call that testnet the GeoPickle. And what it allows us to do is essentially develop quite quickly and flexibly the time synchronization protocol and the blockchain architecture. And we're able to simulate that then in our lab without even using any hardware. And that gets us a lot of input, which I'll touch on the next slide. So that was earlier in 2019. For the first time last month, we actually ran the demo not using the GeoPickle testnet, but with actual radios. That then was the first time connecting the time synchronization protocol, the blockchain architecture, as well as radio devices. And it was the first time that a full presence claim was able to be requested over radio and secured on the blockchain. And I'll get into that next. And so these are all really large milestones for us. And what we're working towards is a reference design for a developer kit, as well as optimizing the actual blockchain software, as there are a lot of bottlenecks I'll be getting into next. So of that previous test environment that I spoke to, this is essentially what it looks like. It's a server rack of 40 Raspberry Pis. As you may remember from the literature, in the Foam protocol, a zone of coverage has a minimum of at least 4 zone anchors. So here in this test environment, each kind of rack has 4 devices. So each of those are able to simulate a zone. And what that actually looks like in practice is that we have multiple zone anchors, all part of different zones that then are actually running the time synchronization protocol and securing that data on the blockchain, but all kind of locally. And because we have then up to 40 zones, we can even build more. We get a lot of benchmark results and simulations without having to necessarily go into the real world. So what that testnet gave us previously was that we can essentially simulate all these zones running and have them reporting to the blockchain, but we can also control different parameters. So that means we could say, hey, zone 1, they can't hear zone 3 every 10 minutes. What happens? Does the system fail? Are they able to recover those fault tolerances? And here, it may not look like it, but with this test environment, we're able to make an enormous amount of progress by basically simulating all these different scenarios. We have colleagues in other projects that are working on mesh nets, and they just went straight to deploying out in the real world, which takes a lot of enormous effort, and you're not able to basically simulate different scenarios in the lab. So at Foam, we're really focused on building a really solid foundation that we can build off of. And that was kind of the philosophy with the Foam map as well. So that was previously with the GeoPickle, but in late May, we then basically, as I said, did the demo not with the GeoPickle, but with actual radios. And this was a very large milestone for us, and definitely one of the first times that a Plasma application was demoed to the public, and especially one that included radio devices validating things over the air. So to unpack really, as I started in this presentation, what's happening with the layers of that demo. We have a layer 1, which is the Ethereum blockchain we all know. We're then connecting a sidechain using Plasma construction. And with that, we use a Tendermint-based consensus. And the layer 3 is the actual hardware. And so as I alluded to, layer 1 is essentially the easiest of the three in that it's already quite known how to develop secure smart contracts, deploy them, give them a logic. The Plasma-based research is essentially bleeding edge. There aren't many projects that are live, if any at all, and it's an open research space. And Tendermint has become an extremely solid foundation to build on top of, but there still are not that many live. So we are collaborating closely with these teams and kind of on the edge of that research. And similarly with the hardware, while I'll go into what we used in this demo, and it's certainly possible to recreate it elsewhere, but we're really focused on being the champions of accuracy and precision and investigating different means of building a developer kit so that there's something really solid that people can, if they obtained it, make sure that that's going to have a durability and not need to be changed. So when we come look at Plasma, there are few to no live implementations that exist today. This is bleeding edge research into layer 2 scalability of how can we scale Ethereum and build these applications that can run really fast and be secure. So with this demo, we were one of the first with a front and back end and full kind of application that I said will soon be publicly available. And so the Foam Plasma demo currently is public. So if you are technically savvy enough, you can take a look of what we built or build it yourself. We'll soon be hosting a version that will be tied to the GeoPickle. So the GeoPickle will be running the timesync protocol, and from a web browser, you can interact with it with test tokens via Plasma. So prior to that being released, if you want to take a look at the GitHub, all the kind of contracts and code are there. But there's a lot of confusion around what really is Plasma, because Plasma is not a project. It's an implementation framework, a way to build things on blockchain. So Plasma is kind of a very confusing world. This website is extremely helpful for those who want to find out a bit more, called Learn Plasma. It's a framework for building scalable blockchain applications. But when you go to get started, it's quite overwhelming because there are so many iterations of people working on this. So this is an interesting map that I found of different Plasma-based projects or different ways to construct Plasma chains. So these are all pretty open-ended research projects. And as I mentioned, not any or many are even live or usable. So with the Foam Plasma implementation, we did work off of the PlasmaMVP, but specifically one that also connects to Tendermint-based consensus. So we worked closely with the Plasma group led by Carl Flourish, as well as the FourthState team based in Berkeley. And the FourthState team is working on a Plasma implementation that also utilizes Tendermint-based consensus. So we essentially forked their iteration of Plasma to then build our own backend, front-end, and server to basically power the application. And with that, most Plasma projects are really focused on simple token exchanges, not much more in terms of smart contracts or state machine logic, because that's extremely difficult to do. But for us, we found Tendermint to be an extremely powerful consensus engine that is fault tolerant and plays into the 3 levels of fault tolerant protocols that we use. I'm going to be speaking about with Rick next. So this project was then basically built off of the Cosmos-based SDK. Cosmos is a protocol for interchain connecting blockchains, and Cosmos itself is powered by Tendermint. So a lot of the developer tools are released under the Cosmos SDK kind of brand. And as you can see here, towards the requirements, it says one of the requirements is Golang. So Go is a programming language released by Google. And that's the only language that the Cosmos SDK exists in today. So the Foam Plasma demo is written in Go. However, we've previously kind of pointed out that the Foam team is a functional programming team. We are experts in Haskell and PureScript. We are the largest contributors to the Haskell Web3 client, and we invented the PureScript Web3 client. And this kind of is an alternative stack to the traditional Java-based Ethereum stack that we've built and is open for anybody to use for any type of project. It's not specific to Foam. But because we feel so strongly about the guarantees and security and iteration abilities of functional-based programming, this is why we're able to go from the beta to the mainnet of the map and can continue to add features to that quite seamlessly because we're focused on such a strong foundation. So a little bit of frustrations from the Foam side of team of working in the Go language for this was that it didn't come with those same kind of security guarantees. So before we go and write more and more complex Plasma iterations and smart contracts, we've actually decided to take a step back and look at the Cosmos SDK as a whole. We've been working closely with the Cosmos team as well as the Kadena team, discussing to implement the Cosmos SDK and ABCI in Haskell. There'll be more to say about that soon, hopefully. But what that essentially gives us is it gives the entire ecosystem a new way to deploy the Cosmos SDK if you have a new options for different kinds of languages. So right now there's only Go for the Cosmos SDK. We're looking into developing functional programming-based iterations of that. And if that is built, it would be something that is available for any developer to use, something open source and a new way to develop with Cosmos SDK. But what it means for Foam is that we have kind of the guarantees and security that we had with the Foam map that we would be able to then really quickly and securely build out more complex versions of the demo that we discussed. So hopefully we can speak more about that publicly soon, but we're kind of taking a holistic approach to the whole architecture and ecosystem and looking at really the foundation and bedrock, making sure we have the most solid footing to really have durability, as this is a project with a lifetime of 5 to 10 to 15 years that we plan to exist for some time. And so that's why we put so much emphasis on really starting at the right footing. So briefly, to get to the demo, I'm just going to speak about what happened with it. And as I said, there'll be a part 2 of this call with the actual webcast of the demo happening. So as I mentioned, with this kind of milestone and demo, we were not running the project on the GeoPickle, but instead we had actual radios. So this is a prototype ZoneAnchor. In the demo, we had 4 of those in the New Lab offices. And so one ZoneAnchor here has actually 4 radios on it, because in this demo, we've utilized the off-the-shelf LoRa 1276 chip. And that is not a gateway, which means it can only speak on one channel. So if you have 4 ZoneAnchors, each ZoneAnchor would need 4 radios to be able to communicate with everybody at the same time. And so the demo worked, as I'll get into in a minute. But it's important to emphasize that this is not the optimal setup of how to run a ZoneAnchor necessarily. But I just want to make clear that it's totally possible for this hardware to be acquired by anybody and for this kind of setup to be built. But we just don't feel it's that fruitful until there's kind of a more advanced developer kit that we've specified that would really have the durability of being able to achieve precision and accuracy in a way that would be viable for testing over a long period. So for us, this is not going to be like the final ZoneAnchor. We're investigating the gateway chips that can speak on multiple channels at the same time, so you don't have 4 radios on one ZoneAnchor. We're also currently working with radio experts on software-defined radio systems and FPGA systems to really, really optimize the time stamping. So for us, getting when the packets are received and when they left, and how are they encoded, and how are they transferred from the chip to the Raspberry Pi, every nanosecond counts. And for us to really determine the optimal way to do that is going to be key before we're kind of rushing to getting these into people's hands, even though we know how eager everyone is to participate. So kind of, as I was saying, why not rush to a hardware release, as that's kind of what many people are looking for. But similarly, as our philosophy with the blockchain software, that we want to make sure that it's functional, secure, and scalable. We want to do the same with hardware before essentially directing tons of people to buy or acquire these off-the-shelf radio chips when it might not be durable for something that kind of is going to make sense 6 months down the line. So the outlook from the demo, which I'll speak to a bit more in a second, is that we are still wrapping up that for public inspection. So the next call will be on that. As said, we're still working on different versions of a hardware design for a further prototype. But for now, we're extremely happy to have demonstrated the full life cycle of a user over radio claiming a presence claim with both a Plasma sidechain implementation and connecting all of that to Ethereum. So that was kind of the first time all of this was wired together. So this is a block diagram of how that demo actually worked. And you see there are kind of 4 actors where you have the Ethereum root chain, the layer 1, a user who will be interacting with it, the Plasma construction as a way to connect to the sidechain, and that then the radios themselves are running. So when you want to interact with this system, the way Plasma works is you first have to lock up your tokens on Ethereum, and you get access to them then on Plasma. And you also might need to burn them to show that you're not going to try and double spend them when you leave. So like I said, the next call is going to be a full webcast of breaking down how this works. But the blog post is out if you want to read a bit more about it, as well as the GitHub repository with all the code. But what that really kind of looked like from the front end is that you're able to deposit tokens into the Plasma sidechain. You can then see what kind of UTXOs you have and how you could use them. Separately, each radio can then also register on the Plasma chain and essentially set up a zone. And then we have this smart contract on Ethereum that's keeping track of zone anchors and what zones they're a part of. And after that kind of process, the presence claim is generated and zones can claim rewards. So happy to answer questions about that, but like I said, we're going to do the follow-up of the full walkthrough on that. So where we really are today, I'm going to now pivot over to our conversation section of the call. But with our emphasis on trying to really push the bleeding edge of this Plasma research and being one of the leaders there of the first kind of demo, but then ultimately a beta software that's available for everybody, but also for the hardware testing and projects that we want to work with. So some of you may know Foam is based in the New Lab, which is in Brooklyn, New York at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And we're really focused actually on starting small and serving an area that's underserved by competitors, but really has a need for this system. So the Navy Yard itself is full of opportunities and validation for need of proof of location. And the kinds of companies that operate in the Navy Yard are actually autonomous vehicle testing. We have bike share companies, electric moped share companies. There's a bus system, a ferry system, cars driving around collecting data, and different people checking into different locations. So this is where what the Navy Yard looks like. And when we are at this next prototype stage of the hardware, this will be the first kind of location for a pilot project where zone anchors will be run and different kind of clients will be able to interact with the system and generating proofs. So for the part 2 of the call, we'll go through the demo there, and for the follow-up after that will be the updates on the time synchronization implementation and the radios. Cool. Rick, are you on the call?
I am on the call.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, so we're going to start this part of the call then as a conversation with Rick. So Rick, thanks for joining us today. Maybe you can just get started by telling us a bit about yourself and what it is you do in the blockchain industry.
Yeah. I'll start, pre-blockchain. I was a systems administrator. I was a computer enthusiast. I filed a patent in 2007 for what is now basically provably fair gaming. That patent was awarded in 2011. Fast forward, a friend of mine threw a hacker convention in 2014. I met some people there. They asked me to evaluate Ethereum. In New York City in November of 2014, there was an Ethereum meetup. I went there. I asked a lot of questions, was very skeptical of the project, met Joe Lubin, worked at Consensus for 4 months. And that's basically when I started doing mechanism design in the blockchain space. And now I run my own company called Vulcanize. And we service, a number of projects with me providing, these sort of advisory and consulting services that I provide to Foam. And I've worked on a number of different projects over the last, starting, I guess, technically in May of 2016. I've worked on probably over 20 projects, about 12 projects a year, actually. So that's it.
Cool. So you said that when you first encountered Ethereum, you were skeptical, had a lot of questions, and even recently you've consistently been stating publicly that you're not a true believer of blockchain. And there's an enormous amount of overexcitement and kind of unrealistic expectations in the space. And you kind of seem to believe these expectations need to be leveled. Could you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I've given 2 talks at ETHCC. I really like Paris, so I'm really happy to talk there. One of them was things I don't like about Ethereum. The other one was parsimonious answers to difficult questions. They're both on YouTube. You can find them. But basically, for me, as a systems administrator and someone with that sort of technical background, there's a lot of claims that were made early on in Ethereum about performance that I think now, given the work that I do with indexing and caching and my work with the Ethereum Foundation, I run working groups there. I mean, it's pretty clear that a lot of those claims were a little overblown. And so what I mean by saying I'm not a true believer is that I believe I'm an extremely firm believer in physics. I'm an extremely firm believer in logic and science and discovery and clear thinking. And so those are the sort of, I apply kind of, collegiate level rhetorical tools to what people say. And so I'm not just not in my nature to be like drinking the Kool-Aid all the time. And that's what I mean is I'm to the best of my ability, I'm always evaluating what people say and how does it fit into my understanding of the world at large. And there's so many things that are discussed in the blockchain space from the very beginning to the present in nearly every project that just, these claims just don't match my understanding of physical reality.
Okay. Is there anything you think can be done to kind of level expectations that kind of onlookers have?
That's a really interesting question. I think that it depends on the sophistication of the observer, right? I think, if you've ever watched the movie Network, which if you haven't, you should, there's only so much you can convince, or the problem is that it's easier to convince people by making pleas to their emotions than it is by explaining to them how reality works. So for the people who are entirely analyzing this environment based on their emotions and their feelings, there's not much I can do for those people. For the people who are trying to understand and are trying to, again, relate what they're hearing to reality, then there's a lot that we can do, which is basically, what is going to happen in the process of doing foam. Teach people physics. Teach people computer science, teach people psychology, teach people economics, and then have them sort of have an understanding or a grounding in those fields so that they can evaluate these things for themselves, which is obviously a very tall order, right? I just said, study these 3 diverse fields of study and you'll be fine. But that's the challenge. I think, ultimately, especially like in the modern era with network is also like a veiled reference to Fox News. I mean, with the emergence of Fox News and how mass media works, it's very difficult for people to get the correct information and then have the tools to reason about it. And so, I try to educate people, but it's also very difficult given, again, the sort of the marketing and the scams and all this stuff in the space. I have to be careful about who I educate and how I educate them.
Definitely. So yeah, shifting gears a bit, maybe you can say how you, to our viewers, how you got involved with Foam and what initially attracted you to working on the project.
Oh, well, I worked with Christopher while we were at Consensus. We were at Consensus at the same time, so that's how I met you folks. And yeah, I mean, he asked for some help on some of these. There's some very complicated mechanism design issues in this project, like extremely complicated. And I'd actually been thinking about proof of location. I met, I guess it must have been Consensus, the event, maybe 2016, maybe even 2015. I met David Vorik from Saya, and I immediately asked, well, how do you know that the hard drive, so that's a storage protocol. And I was like, well, how do you know that there's actually separate hard drives? Like, how do you prove that there's actually 4 different hard drives in 4 different places? And he didn't really have an answer for that. Incidentally, Filecoin also has even less of an answer for that. And so that's what actually got me thinking about proof of location. So then when Christopher reached out and you guys sort of talked about your proof of location desires, I got really excited because I had already been thinking about this problem for a while. So that's sort of how I got into it.
Great. So one of your key contributions has been, overwhelming around the mechanism designs, but really kind of like narrowing in on what's the end result of this protocol. And kind of the end result is that we have something unique to other kind of location approaches, which is what we call presence claims. So that people with this infrastructure is set up and you can interact with it. You have this fraud-proof attestation, kind of like its own token that you can build up a bag of and carry around receipts of where you've been. So why do you think that we need presence claims versus other ways to find out where people are?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about this while you were talking and earlier, and it's really interesting. I mean, the killer use case that I like to point out to people in the business world is presence claims associated with autonomous vehicles, like you were discussing. If I'm a car and I'm driving from northern Germany to southern Italy, I'm going through, however many countries that is. It depends on which route you take, I suppose. And each one of those countries has their own jurisdiction. So if I'm an autonomous vehicle and I want information about the weather conditions, the road conditions, construction, traffic, there's no single authority, legal authority that can give me that information. And also I may be wanting to sell my telemetry to other people. I want to sell my telemetry to the car manufacturer. I want to sell my telemetry to the tire manufacturer. I want to sell my telemetry to other cars, other vehicles, maybe flying drones or something like this. And maybe I'm taking pictures of the scenery and I want to sell that to Google Maps or whatever. So all of that information that is intimately related to a physical location needs to be presented in a Byzantine fault-tolerant way, because there is no authority that can be trusted to manage all of that data, even though I have this single machine generating it through the course of its operation. So I think that's, to me, the sort of the straightforward killer application. The other one, which might be more appealing, I don't really, frankly, I'm not super well versed in the foam community, but if we're more of a younger orientation and don't have billion-dollar companies, something that might be more interesting to us is countering deep fakes. If you embed a presence claim in every frame, every key frame of a video, you could prove that the video is not fake, which is a really fascinating idea. This idea that we can create authenticated data streams using presence claims. I think that broadly, that's the more abstract version. The autonomous vehicle is an applied application of that, and the resistance to deep fakes, authentic video is another application that I think might resonate more with people. Yeah.
Great. So in your kind of like last answer, you're putting emphasis on the importance of a Byzantine fault-tolerant system. And when we first started discussing this project 2 years ago, that was kind of the crux of your requirements. Kept saying, if it's not fault-tolerant, we're not going to do it, or we shouldn't do it. Maybe for those who are not as versed in the kind of literature, can you maybe just say why fault tolerance is so important?
Right. So there's different types of faults and there's different types of fault tolerance. So in the computer science literature, they have this sort of broad fault tolerant definition, which is just like your computer fails. And then there's Byzantine fault tolerance, which is you have a malicious actor. So, and they don't really describe how they're malicious because it's more theoretical. But because of the interest of blockchains, because of the excitement of blockchains, people are now starting to talk about different types of Byzantine faults. So now you can sort of discuss different faults and treat them differently. They're important because you're trying to get agreement with people. So maybe let's not even think about it. Well, there's benefits of thinking about it as people. So imagine we're all in a group, but we don't know each other. We don't have a history. We don't work together. We just all sort of met up in the street spontaneously. There's 7 of us, and we need to make a decision about something. A Byzantine fault-tolerant algorithm means that like our sincere intentions are what gets manifested as opposed to some sort of duplicitous or sort of malicious act. That analogy sort of breaks down, but again, I'm trying to make it like approachable to like lay people. We can talk about it in a more technical sense as well.
Yeah. So you're saying people are starting to research different kinds of fault tolerance, and Dominic from Definity has a pretty interesting tweet saying, kind of boiling it down to that there are 3 flavors of BFT. We have asynchronous, partially synchronous, and fully synchronous. And I think Foam might be one of the only protocols attempting to use all 3. What do you think of that as being kind of an interesting component?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think again, it really, there's this fundamental, I mean, we're talking about how do you prove a radio with a particular private key that was burned into it at manufacturing time is really in the place that it's claiming to be. This is a very physical question. And because it is such a, most blockchain questions are very abstract. And this is a very physical one. And because it is, talking about time and distance, these physical properties, you have to leverage every type of algorithm to get this information in aggregate. Obviously, the world compared to the size of a microchip is an enormous place. And so you have to leverage every technique to get that information reliably from one location to another. So it's information about a location, and you want to take that information about a location and move it to another location. And you have to do that at scale, and you have to do that efficiently. And that's why you need all 3 types of algorithms. So you need the synchronous algorithm to get agreement on what time it is. And by agreeing on what time it is, you can now use, time difference of arrival or something like that to figure out exactly where you are relative to each other. And now you can start generating the claims from that. But because these cryptographic challenges are happening at the speed of light, you have to generate quite a lot of data to really have a meaningful assertion about where something is. And because it's so much data, you use a partially synchronous network with better finality guarantees to store that Tendermint. And then with Ethereum today, the trust anchor for Ethereum today is proof of work, which is asynchronous protocol. And you're using that because you don't want any individual. It's more important that you have this tight coupling to the work than it is that you get the messages out in a timely manner. And so that's why we need all 3 protocols, because we're really traversing the whole domain of, literally like this sort of deep epistemological question about where things are in space.
Yeah. So just to recap for those following, the 3 kinds of BFT protocols Foam is using is a synchronous one, which is over radio. So you have time synchronization happening, and if there's a fault or some zones turn off, it's able to reestablish the time sync. Then locally on each zone, we're using Tendermint consensus, which is partially synchronous to log that data and keep a shared state machine. And the asynchronous fault-tolerant protocol is Ethereum itself, which is asynchronous because it happens over the internet. The internet itself is not synchronized. But on this kind of middle layer of Tendermint, Rick, you were the first person to introduce me to Tendermint consensus a few years ago. And since then, it's kind of come out of the woodwork and garnered a reputation as one of the most solid and useful consensus engines out there. Maybe you can speak to what you saw in Tendermint before everyone else, and how it's kind of being played out in the ecosystem.
Yeah, when I was at Consensus, actually the first time I heard about Ethereum, I asked some very famous people in the Ethereum space, so I'm not going to name them during this call. I've named them other places. Do you know about Paxos? Do you know about Cassandra? Do you know about these existing fault tolerance algorithms that don't perform super well and are less constrained, have weaker constraints than what they were claiming, and they didn't really know about it. So Jay was one of the first people I met in the Jay was one of the first people I heard about who was really doing the research into like DLS, FLP, and was publishing it in the ecosystem. So the Bitcoin paper, like it's like a citation of a citation or something somewhere in there does talk about BFT in a meaningful way. And obviously the people who made proof of work were well versed with those consensus algorithms. But it at the time, 2015, it wasn't super widely discussed in the community, in spite of the fact that people were making claims that absolutely required a knowledge of these types of algorithms. And I had contributed to the early Casper conversations, and I still, talk to Vlad every once in a while. So Tendermint was really the first algorithm that I encountered in the space that had proper citation and really, referenced PBFT and DLS the right way. And so that's why I was excited about it then, and I'm still excited about it now.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate you turning us onto it. We're excited to be working with Tendermint. So we're going to move to like the final questions that we've prepared. So this is a bit open-ended, but it's extremely common that we encounter skepticism and critique on the Foam protocol, especially in terms of attack vectors. One of the ones we hear a lot of worries about is if a new zone appears, how do you really know it is really there? And so I know that we've spoken at length about this. Maybe we can start to unpack why we don't see this as such a huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that. I don't want to be too critical of strangers. I mean, maybe one of my best friends, maybe my mother holds this opinion. I don't know. I've never asked, but it's if you think about it naively, if you only partially think through the problem, then you create the Alaska problem or the Antarctica problem. It's easy to stumble into this problem. I mean, even our first conversations, a third party was in the conversation that we're not going to mention, but was obsessed with relay attacks. What if I'm just relaying my presence claim, which I'm not going to describe now, but the relay problem and the Antarctica problem emerge when you don't fully think through what a presence claim really is. You're really making an assertion about where you are. And in order to do that in a meaningful way, someone has to agree that someone was someplace. We don't just use the cryptographic attestations to assert where we are, because then that's not sufficient. You have to have people agree that these different messages actually originated at some place. You need some sort of trust anchor for location. And if you don't have, just like we have in proof of work, we use the difficulty of hashing algorithms as the trust anchor. We know we can't reverse the hash algorithm. We know people can't spoof the proof of work. That's why we trust these proof of work based blockchains. And in a similar vein, it's different, but it's similar. Just like we all have to come to a consensus about the hashing algorithm, we all have to come to a consensus. Well, and let me phrase that in the counterfactual case to make it super clear for people, because it's not something that comes up very often in the community. if I didn't believe these one-way hash functions were robust, then I shouldn't believe the proof of work attestation in a blockchain. I shouldn't believe that a blockchain is uncorruptible. And in the similar vein, if we don't agree that the first zone in Foam is where it says it is, then we shouldn't trust any of the data. All of the data is ultimately derivative of the initial zone. We have to put the first zone somewhere, and we have to all agree that it's actually there. And if we don't do that, then of course we can't believe the assertions about zones in Antarctica or zones anywhere else, because we literally have never established where the zones are. And in a similar vein, if we make assertions that are incorrect about the speed of light, or we make assertions that are incorrect about the speed of signing the messages, then we'll be wrong about the distances between these objects. And again, we'll fail to correctly assert where things actually are in space. But if you do that correctly, and you, again, the mobile beacon that we talk about in that blog post, the mobile beacon has been proven to be at the trust anchor at some point in time, and then some sufficient amount of time later, it proves that it's in some other zone that's a disjoint from the original initial zone. If the travel time fits, and we believe that mobile beacon because it has a reputation and it has stake, it's a staked reputation, and it hasn't violated physics. It's not signing faster than the speed of light. And again, we're using physics again to believe that the private keys are unextractable from the radio. If we accept these assertions, then it should be easy to challenge and verify zones that are disjoint. And again, I'm hesitant to get into the details of that in the call, but it's pretty clear in my mind how it would work, and I think that there's at least an outline of it in the blog post, and there's certainly some details there that we may touch on later in the call, but I think that the Antarctica problem is fundamentally based on a misunderstanding of how you have to build up a system of trust. And the relay problem, which I think is a more sincere criticism, because it's based on the assumption that you can't extract the private key from the hardware, or that there's a cost to doing that. And it's easy to be skeptical of that. But if we say that it costs $2 million to extract the private key from a radio, and we do this interactive signing, which is why it has to be interactive. So all of these protocols that claim to do proof of location with passive radios don't make any sense. But if you're doing this interactive proof with the radio, and you know that the private key is definitely embedded in the hardware, and it would be millions of dollars to extract it, then that's the economic guarantee that you have that a relay attack isn't occurring. You can also just analyze the speed of light. So the other thing is even duplicating the private key doesn't necessarily buy you that much. Again, because of the interactive nature of the protocol. So the protocol being interactive is vitally important. It's absolutely necessary to provide a real presence claim. Anything that's not doing a real interactive protocol, or doesn't provide all of the evidence of the interactive protocol, isn't going to be a real presence claim.
Yeah. So just going to try to unpack a bit of your answer, which is really helpful and great. So the idea is that similar to kind of Casper Ether 2.0, once we're at the stage where the software is essentially better or more available, we're going to have people actually running test nets of these themselves and in different locations. And once we get to the point where we're going to say, hey, the protocol is now live, there's going to be a way for these people who have been putting in the efforts to test these systems to participate in some sort of ceremony to become a trust zone. And so that basically pegging that zone to some geospatial place on Earth. And from there, new zones that appear around it can kind of self-validate themselves because they have overlapping connections with the trust anchor. And then more and more zones that appear around it are connected to zones that have previously been connected to the trust anchor. So the network can kind of grow out from that trust anchor. But kind of then the most interesting point is what happens when you have that zone that pops up on the other side of the city or the other side of the country, and it's not actually physically or topographically connected to that trust zone. And that's kind of what people refer to, or we refer to, as this Antarctica problem. You see a zone just appeared in Antarctica. It's really hard to go there yourself. It's not connected to any other zone. And so there's a topic that we haven't really unpacked much, which is the TFAR contract. It's in this blog post that Rick spoke about. The name is a work in progress, but it stands for the Total Foam Area Reward Contract. And this is basically going to be the almost controller of the protocol that on the root chain will determine how many rewards each zone is eligible for. It's going to look at how much area each zone is covering, how many tokens they have staked, and also if they're operating in an area of signals, which would boost their rewards. But when we have this zone that kind of appears out of nowhere and it has no reputation, the TFAR contract is going to say, you're not actually a valid zone. And so how does this new zone connected to nobody actually become part of the TFAR to be eligible for rewards? And what Rick was explaining, I'll try to just say in a different manner, is that you're going to have these actors. You can call them mobile beacons. A different name might be like watchmen. And those are location customers that are not just using the system in an app. They're actually an actor in the protocol. And so for this new zone that's not connected to anybody, they're going to need to attract customers that are these watchmen to come to their zone and purchase a presence claim. And this new zone is going to require a certain % of total foam to be attested to it. And it could be that as it attracts more and more watchmen to attest that it's a real zone, it could be basically slightly recognized by the TFAR and maybe earn some of the rewards until it passes some threshold of having attracted enough people that have already been proven to be in a trusted location to then essentially tie this zone that's physically separated, but tie it topographically into the network. So that if you actually attracted somebody who had been in previously defined zones to your new zone, that new zone now can, by attracting enough foam to it, be considered part of the protocol or be eligible for rewards. And that's like a really innovative kind of technique, I think, that we've discussed, Rick, about having that new zone have a certain % of the total foam attested to it, so that it makes it very difficult for those watchmen to basically be visible because they actually need the tokens as well to basically initiate that zone into the TFAR.
Yeah. I think this sort of ceremonial application of transitive trust, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of intuitive sense. We all agree that the original zone was there. Once we do that, we all agree that these mobile beacons have signed messages connected to the original zone. And then once we've done that, those people have then moved, and now they're attesting that this new zone is there. They're like monks, right? They're like the clerics coming, going on a pilgrimage to like prove that this other place really exists. And I think that that's actually like very intuitive, very elegant, if I do say so myself. It trying to do it. There's other ways of doing it. But I think that and again, we will probably discuss some of these other ways in the future, but I think that this should satisfy the other ways are more centralized. I mean, this is or rely on other authorities like GPS, for example, but rather rely more on GPS than this does. But I think this technique is very strong. It's a very strong technique in that it's very difficult to. There's not like a weak link. Either this works and the whole system is robust, or this fails because there's a fundamental flaw that applies to the whole system.
Well, we're wrapping up towards the end of the call, so I have 2 questions left. But another really key component, which we've touched on with the TFAR, is that there'll actually be incentives to run these zones in the form of mining rewards. And the TFAR contract is going to be the one that essentially is the final determinant of if the zone is correctly producing the correct timestamps. If we remember, a zone is to maintain a quorum over time and space in where they are, and they're going to be doing so because they, one, will be able to receive more foam by participating, but then also basically run their business by interacting with customers. So that's really where kind of the real value is going to be, or the real value capture of actually being able to offer this service to customers. But before that, we really need to build up the supply side of the network and make sure that there actually is coverage to begin with before anyone could even consider using it for their use cases. So maybe what do you think of like how crucial it is that there are going to be these kinds of rewards, and by participating in these 3 levels of BFT protocols that you are kind of contributing work, so that you are, not to abuse the language, but mining in some senses. So how important are those rewards to the health or growth of the network?
I mean, I think they're extremely important in terms of getting community engagement. And I think demonstrating the theory, and demonstrating that there's actually, I mean, I think, you have to demonstrate that people are willing to run the radios, and we're sort of going the amateur route. I mean, that's what we discuss in public, let's say. And so if you demonstrate that there's this amateur demand, both this amateur willingness to operate the radios and amateur demand for the presence claims, then obviously that will bootstrap, like with any industry. I think basically all industries start with amateurs, and then amateurs develop into professionals. And so I think that there's definitely a path from this sort of demonstration of concept, demonstration of demand, demonstration of supply. I think the transition from that into a real professional ecosystem will be short and will be powerful, because I'm going to spill a little secret on people. There's radio waves everywhere. There's people running radios and broadcasting signals all over the place. There is an enormous amount of radio traffic already. And if you are someone who operates a lot of radios, if I'm going to pay you to operate this other relatively easy for the professional to operate radio, why not do it? So I think that there's a huge opportunity for Foam to work in areas where there would be a lot of demand for presence claims, i.e. highways, cities, commercial environments of lots of commercial activity, like docks, people moving, cargo ships.
This is why pointing out as the Navy Yard is like one of the most perfect test beds, in that we have ferry terminals, buses, self-driving cars that are actually picking people up from the ferry and driving them to the new lab, jump bicycles, mopeds, people checking into the building. And that's really, to me, an example of like an underserved market of people where there's latent demand for this kind of service.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's absolutely important to to accelerate the development of this sort of technology. These incentives for amateurs are super important. With an understanding that will demonstrate to professionals that there's a real market, and once the professionals step in, it'll be truly transformative. Because right now we don't really appreciate. There's so much fraud, right? If people are committing this fraud to like catch all the Pokemon, like what will happen when that inhibits us from we can't use this sort of technology for commerce, because 13-year-olds are committing fraud for video games. So you can't move like real value using the existing location techniques. We need and it's happening in spite of that, right? Again, autonomous vehicles are happening with this sort of ignorance that, hey guys, we actually don't know where things are in space programmatically, like in a robust way. But okay, don't worry, we're going to have this driverless car. No one's going to spoof it. And that's just like terrifying. At one point, you do a good job of posting the articles on Twitter, but there was years ago, the London Mercantile Exchange or some exchange in London was going down because apparently some UPS driver was spoofing their location at a certain time every day. And so the UPS truck would drive by, generate interference, take out the GPS, which was how the exchange equipment was maintaining its clock sync. This is absurd, right? So we
$100 device to spoof your UPS truck, and that guy's just trying to hide from his boss so he can take a longer route.
Yeah, exactly. This guy's just trying to like eat lunch in a nice park or something, and he's like messing up like, you know, billions or millions of hundreds of millions of dollars of transactions. So the demand for presence claims is really strong. It's just that people don't realize that the solution even exists. It's like lots of people have this problem. Lots of industries say, man, I wish I knew for real where my fleet of trucks was really.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, if we had a foam radio in every light pole on the highway, which is totally possible, that's not unreasonable economically at all. You would know where that truck was with very high with cryptographically very high certainty, very easily. And so I think that the opportunities are really immense for people who, you know, participate sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's from our understanding that this market is extremely suppressed, or it's basically would be a whole new market in that, like Pokemon, people are gaming the system, but the actual company missed out on enormous amounts of revenue opportunities because they wanted to partner with the Pokestops. So if you go to the cafe because of this game and then you buy some cookies and iced tea, a percent of that should go to the game because the game brought you there. But they weren't able to capture this value because of the amount of spoofing. And we saw a promotion recently from Burger King, which says if you go to McDonald's and you open the Burger King app, you can order food for 1 cent. But now I don't actually have to go to McDonald's. I can just do that from home by spoofing my location. So these kinds of like retail promotions are actually really suppressed, and that's just one corner of what this would unlock. So we're hitting the end of the hour, so I'll just end with my final question. But thank you so much, Rick, for being a part of this conversation. As someone who's been involved with this project for quite some time, can you maybe speak to the progress that you've seen since we began with essentially, you know, just an idea on a whiteboard, and maybe just as a closing statement, put in perspective for our viewers what the milestone we've actually reached means, as we know that it's a bit technical still.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely impressive for people with, I mean, as I understand it, little to no radio background when you started, to have built and run prototype radios that can do this sort of unique application, this unique use case of cryptographically signing radio messages, you know, almost in its own right. That's extremely impressive. I'm always very impressed with the foam engineering team and the ability to, you know, work on these relatively hard problems and get results relatively quickly. I mean, from the time that you started on the Plasma Tendermint to the time that it actually got something working, I mean, compared to many teams in the space, it was very fast and in my opinion, high quality. Again, I work with dozens of teams, and most of my clients, I don't engage with them on the technicals. I guess the way to phrase this best would be, when I engage with clients on the pure technical side, they're usually very strong, and for you guys also fit into that pattern. You know, the technical strength is really there, and it shows. And I think really that board with the radios on it, you know, if you can just, you know, put that on some roofs and get it to do the same thing on those roofs, or even better, get it to like not work a little bit in the rain and then get it to work in the rain. Like, I mean, that's kind of like it. I mean, you're done. I mean, to me, that's such a strong indicator that this idea makes sense, and that it's actually practical in the field. I mean, the field milestones that we're going through are really, again, impressive. The GeoPickle is a vital, device. I mean, system. I didn't think of that. I mean, that's brilliant. Like that, really using Raspberry Pis in that way, because what a lot of people don't understand is you can't really simulate clocks. And so by just having a little box in your office filled with clocks, I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, that really solves, a simulation problem that other people can't. You really can't do that in AWS. AWS literally has like clock skew that's so high. I've had problems with clock skew in AWS, and I'm not trying to measure the speed of light, right? So for you to be able to have a platform that does that is, it's very clever. It's really intelligent.
Great. Thanks for putting that all into perspective. And thank you again so much for taking the time to join us on this call.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I don't see any active comments in the YouTube of questions, but you know where to find us on Twitter or Discourse, and we'll be following up next time with the webcast of this Plasma demo. Thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend.